Hello and welcome. This is Abdel Jabbar from Grandstream Networks. In today's video, we will learn about the emergency calls feature built into the Grandstream IP-PBX UCM 6000 series. This feature offers several functionalities to help you comply with local regulations, protect users in case of an emergency, and help the response team to quickly locate a distressed caller. So throughout this video, we will explore these functionalities and explain how they work. The UCM can be configured to directly route calls for emergency services without a prefix or going through an operator. Emergency calls can also be routed with a higher priority than normal calls. This is especially useful in cases where all the lines are busy and there is a need to make an emergency call. In such a scenario, the UCM will automatically drop the active call to make the line available for the emergency call. In addition, designated staff can be set up to receive a notification through a voice call, an email, and a screen display with information about the location or the extension that makes the call. Plus, auto recording can be enabled for these calls and send these recordings to some email addresses that you define when you create the emergency call feature. In a deployment environment where one UCM appliance handles calls from multiple locations, the UCM supports mapping extension numbers with emergency caller IDs. And later in this video, I will show you how this feature is used to identify the caller's location based on source caller ID, which can also be used to return the call by emergency services if necessary. So to illustrate the functionality of emergency calls on the UCM 6000 series, we will use a hotel case scenario. In this example, the UCM is connected with both SIP and analog trunks for redundancy, and emergency calls are configured to use both trunks as a point of exit just in case one of the trunks is down. The emergency calls feature is also set up to immediately notify the receptionist with the voice call and to send an instant email notification to the hotel manager or the security staff. So when a hotel guest makes a call to emergency services, the UCM will route the call directly using the selected trunk. Immediately after the call is initiated, the UCM notifies the receptionist phone with a voice call, and it displays information about the extension or the room that has made the call. In addition, the UCM can be configured to send an email notification to the hotel manager or the security staff, which also includes information about the extension and the room that has made the call. The emergency call is now automatically recorded, and a designated personnel or staff can have these recordings be sent to the email address after the call is complete. One thing that I would like to emphasize here is that callers need to be connected directly to public safety services without going through an operator or a receptionist, and there should not be any required prefix when they dial emergency services numbers. For example, here in the US, with Carey's law that was signed into law in 2018, this law prohibits requiring a prefix when calling emergency services. So it is very important to always ensure that you are in compliance with the country and local regulations regarding emergency calls. Hotels are usually large buildings with multiple rooms and key carded areas, and the on-site notifications sent by the UCM to alert the hotel staff to the emergency can prepare them to direct emergency response team to the exact location, saving them valuable time and in some cases even provide first aid if necessary. So the voice notification with the visual alert together with the email message that the UCM sends to the designated contact are crucial in helping dispatch the response team to the exact location. This is critical in circumstances where the distressed caller cannot communicate his or her room, as it ensures the hotel staff is able to send the emergency response team to the correct room. So now that we illustrated how emergency calls are being handled by the UCM, let's dive into the configuration of these parameters using the web interface of the UCM. So let's log in to the web interface of the UCM using my login credentials. For this tutorial, I'm using the UCM on version 1.0.20.23. So let's go to the call emergency calls feature. So it's available under call features. You scroll down, emergency calls, and as you can see, I don't have any emergency calls number configured. So let's go ahead and create one. So I'm going to click on add. Then this is the configuration parameters that you need to use to configure your emergency call service on the UCM. So let's go ahead and describe each of these parameters and how you can use them. So the name, you can just give it any name. So for example, I'm going to use, let's call it emergency services. And the emergency number, this is the number that the users, they're gonna dial to reach emergency services in your area. So for example, we can use 911, which is the emergency number for North America. And the emergency level, the UCM provides you with 3 levels: not urgent, moderately urgent, and significantly urgent. Definitely for 911, you want to choose significantly urgent. The reason you need to configure emergency level is when you have a limited number of outgoing calls, like concurrent calls on the SIP trunk or the analog trunk, and you have multiple emergency numbers configured on the UCM. For example, when you set the emergency number to 911 and you assign it an emergency level of significantly urgent, that means if there are other emergency numbers with the other levels like moderately urgent or not urgent, the UCM will prioritize the routing of calls based on the emergency level. And the highest level is significantly urgent, then moderately urgent, then not urgent. Next, there is this option right here that we call Hunt on Busy. By default, it is enabled. So, and I suggest and I recommend that you always keep it unchecked because you're going to need this option. So let me explain to you how this feature works. Let's take the example where you have a UCM configured with 2 analog trunks and both analog trunks are busy. Then one of the users initiates an emergency call to one of the services. So when you have this option unchecked, in other words, enabled, when the analog trunks are busy while that user is trying to make an emergency call, the UCM will drop off one of the active calls to make the line available for the emergency call. So that's why it's always important to leave that one unchecked, especially for significantly urgent services. In case you have this one configured, let's say for a number that is not urgent, let's say like some information, a number that only provides information to users, you can enter that one and you can set it to not urgent. Then you can check this option. This way the UCM doesn't drop any active calls to make the line available for that emergency number, which is not an urgent call. So let's uncheck this one and put these back to 911. Custom prompt. So by default, when the user makes an emergency call, the UCM is going to call one of these extensions that you select under the members to be notified. You can select one, you can select two, you can select as many as you want, as long as you don't exceed the number of concurrent calls of your UCM. So what happens when someone makes an emergency call, the UCM is going to notify these extensions under the selected area. Then when the user answers the phone, or you can also configure the phone to auto answer and to play the audio on speaker, the UCM is going to tell the user or whoever person is assigned these extensions, it's going to tell them the source of the emergency call and which emergency number the user has dialed. You can use that one, or you can upload your own customized prompt. So when someone makes an emergency call, the UCM is going to call one of these extensions under the selected area. Then it's going to play the sound file that you upload to this option. You can, for example, upload this one. This is a WAV file that I have in my UCM. You can upload your own. Then right here under the use trunks, as you can see, I have multiple trunks and you can choose them based on priority. So let's say, for example, I'm going to use my SIP trunk as the primary one. Then I want to use the analog line as the secondary one. So in case there is no internet or the service provider has some issues that I cannot reach the service provider to make emergency calls through it, I can tell the UCM to use the analog lines or the analog trunks as a failover to route emergency calls. And you can choose as many trunks as of course, depending on which model you have and how many SIP trunks you're allowed to have and how many analog trunks you have. So if we scroll down here, you're going to see some options here like strip and prepend. If you are using the UCM with the SIP trunk or the analog trunks, usually you don't need these options. In some cases where the users, for example, are like you just installed the UCM and the users are still accustomed to the old system where they have to prepend each call with 9, you can tell the UCM to strip 1. But one thing that you have to remember, if you do that change, you need to come here and change the emergency number to 911. So this way, when the users they dial 911, the UCM is going to strip the 9 and send only 911. And by the way, this is something that is no longer allowed in the US following the requirements of Kerry's Law. In other words, you can't require the users to prepend emergency numbers with 9 or 8 or any other numbers that you use to prepend numbers. So if you are in the United States and you want to follow the requirements of Kerry's Law, just make sure you enter the service number without any prepended prefix, and you just leave these boxes right here empty, so that users, when they want to reach an emergency service, all they need to do is dial the number 911. Next, you have the option, the auto record. This is useful for traceability in case you would like to have all your emergency calls recorded on the UCM so you can have access to these files. When needed, you can always check the auto record. There is also the option where you can send those recordings to an email address. And you can include, for example, like let's say you have your security department and they require to receive copies of those emergency calls that were made, or the administrator or the owner. You can include multiple emails. I believe you can go up to 10 emails that you can enter here so that the UCM can notify all these users with these emails with the emergency call that was made, together with the attachment of the call, the recording of the call, if you have this option checked. And one thing about this feature also is the UCM will send this email when the emergency call is done, which means the user call the emergency, then they hang up the call. That's when the UCM is going to send you the notification with the recording attached to the email. The UCM also has another option to send an email. So I'm going to jump to maintenance, and we go to system events, alert, events list, and you're going to look for emergency calls, and I believe it is enabled by default right here. And what happens when someone makes an emergency call, the UCM is going to send an immediate notification through an email that you have configured under right here. And the same thing, you can include up to 10 emails. This is an immediate notification. In other words, once the user dials, for example, 911, the UCM is going to send you an email notification to tell you that there is an emergency call that was made from that specific device and with that extension number, and the email also is going to include the emergency number that was dialed. So in case you would like to notify a group of security staff or managers or administrators, you just go ahead, add the emails, and then you can add them right here, then save and apply the changes. So let me go back here to call features. I'm sorry, to emergency calls. So we have now configured the 911 emergency calls. You can add multiple ones, and you can assign them again different emergency levels. So I'm just going to create one for now, and when you have the auto record enabled on the emergency calls number that you just configured, this is where you have access to all these recordings. You can download them, or you can select the ones that you would like to download. You can clear them, and you can also save those recordings on an external drive like USB drive or an SD card, because I don't have any USB or SD card not connected. That's why they're not showing right here. But once you connect to USB drive or an SD card, then when you go to the storage device management, you can select the USB drive or an SD card. Then you can have all of them available on that specific device. Another thing that I would like to mention here, which is a very nice feature, it's under extensions. The UCM now supports a nice feature that we call emergency calls caller ID. So when someone, let's say extension 1000, dials 911, and the UCM has multiple DIDs, you can tell the UCM which source caller ID to use when someone dials an emergency number. This is the caller ID that this extension is going to use for regular calls. And this is the caller ID that this extension is going to use to make emergency calls. To explain this with more details, let's look at this example. So the emergency calls caller ID is useful when you have one UCM managing a location with multiple buildings or multiple floors, and each building or floor has its own physical address and unique emergency location identification number. And this way, when a user dials an emergency services number, the dispatcher can quickly dispatch emergency help even if the caller is unable to communicate the location. And also the dispatcher can use the emergency caller ID to contact the caller in case he or she disconnects prematurely. And to use the feature emergency calls caller ID, the emergency response location must be defined for each building or each floor and must be uploaded to Public Safety Services database. In other words, you must supply the public safety services with the emergency caller IDs and their associated emergency response location or the physical address. You can also arrange that through your carrier and or service provider. They can help you to map a physical address for each caller ID so that they become available to the public safety dispatcher. And this is a service I believe that most ITSPs provide, especially in North America. So in this example, we have one UCM that handles calls from extensions in two locations, the main office and the adjacent warehouse. Each location is defined with a unique caller ID for emergency calls, and these caller IDs are used by the emergency services to locate the physical addresses. So when emergency calls are made from the extension range used by the warehouse, the UCM will use the emergency location identification number 617-123-4567 as the source caller ID. And when the emergency services see the source caller ID, the system will automatically match it to the emergency response location, which is the warehouse. So it's very important to note that this feature works only in cases where the caller ID is tied to a single physical address. So besides the option to match emergency calls caller ID to an extension or a range of extensions, starting with the UCM version 1.0.20.20, the UCM now supports assigning caller ID for emergency calls based on source IP subnet. Similar to the emergency calls caller ID with the source extension, this feature can also be used to help identify the location of the caller who makes the emergency call based on the source IP address. This could be a useful feature to add to your system, especially with mobile devices. For instance, in a building with multiple floors where each floor has its own IP subnet, and when a user with a mobile device like the Grandstream wireless IP phone WP820 or WP810, if the user using that wireless phone makes an emergency call, the UCM will be able to match the location of the wireless IP phone based on the source IP address or the access point that belongs to that specific IP address while the user is roaming between the floors. So let's go back to the web interface of the UCM so I can show you where you can configure this option. So we explained the emergency calls caller ID that you can assign it to an extension or range of extension or group of extensions. Let's go back to emergency calls so I can show you how you can assign emergency caller ID based on the IP subnet. So this option can be configured under the emergency location mapping. It's very straightforward, it's very easy to configure. So for example, if you own this caller ID, which is for example one of the DIDs assigned to your SIP trunk or analog trunk, you can enter that one here, then you can specify the subnet. You can tell, for example, the UCM, if someone makes an emergency call from this subnet and you already know that this subnet, for example, belongs to 123 West Street, first floor, the UCM is not going to send that information, but it's only for the administrator to know which subnet belongs to which physical location. So every time someone makes an emergency call from this subnet that belongs to this physical address, the UCM is going to use this caller ID as the source caller ID for emergency calls. You can save that one, then you can add another caller ID. Let's say, for example, you own this number and this one belongs to second floor. You can just write that information here so you can remember it. And then, for example, the subnet of the second floor is a different subnet. So you just include the subnet right here, save, and apply the changes. And you can choose, depending how you have your system deployed, if you are using multiple VLANs or multiple IP subnets, you can choose this option. In case you are using one IP subnet and you have multiple extensions in different floors or different locations, you can use the emergency calls caller ID at the extension level. Make your phone system infrastructure compliant with the regulations, and to avoid any issues that might prevent distressed callers from receiving the help they need from emergency services, there are a few guidelines that you can follow. And as I mentioned earlier, when you configure the emergency calls on the UCM, you must have a working analog trunk or SIP trunk or a PRI configured on the UCM. Also, all users using IP phones registered to the UCM should be allowed to directly dial emergency calls to public safety services. And also, one thing to avoid is do not create a rule that might require a prefix for emergency services. When you create your own extensions, try to avoid an extension range that might include numbers that are already used by the emergency services like 911 or 311. You don't want to create an extension with 911 as an internal extension while this number is being used for emergency services. To comply with some regulations, you can also enable voice and email notification, as I showed you, using the emergency calls feature, so that the staff can identify the location of a distressed caller when there is an emergency call that is made. When you have a UCM that is managing multiple buildings or locations, it's always very important to map emergency calls caller ID with the emergency response location. Another thing, the emergency caller ID must be reachable from the emergency services for callback purposes. Sometimes distressed callers, they make calls to the emergency services and they get disconnected prematurely. Some regulations, for example in the United States, it is required that the emergency services must be able to call back the distressed caller using the same source caller ID. And for mobile users and remote workers, it's very important to educate them that they must use their cellular or locally configured phones like a landline to make calls to emergency services.